Once again, some member states continue to use the platform of the Security Council to politicize humanitarian work in the Syrian Arab Republic and relevant discussions, and to promote a selective perspective of the humanitarian situation there. These country statements focused on what would serve their goals, including their feverish efforts to extend and strengthen the cross-border assistance mechanism. At the same time, they deliberately ignore the disastrous effects of the unilateral coercive measures imposed by them on the Syrian people. This makes clear that these countries do not aspire to genuine humanitarian work, but rather to achieving political goals through the misuse and exploitation of the humanitarian situation. Madam President, it would have been more useful for the delegations of those countries, particularly the United States, to seize this high-level meeting to denounce their failed policies over the past 10 years that has led Syria to this disastrous situation. Would it not have been more productive for the United States to announce today the termination of its occupation of Syrian territories and to put an end to its support of separatist militias and stop the plunder of Syrian wealth? Would it not have been more productive to demand the Turkish regime to withdraw its military forces from Syrian territory and stop its support for terrorist organizations and affiliated entities? Would it not have been more productive to speak with one voice against all those who deny Syrians access to their utmost needed economic resources? The positions of some countries to which we listen today do not in any way help to improve the humanitarian situation in my country, Syria, enshrining dictations by these countries, imposing conditionality on reconstruction, ignoring all calls for the lifting of unilateral coercive measures, and obstructing the return of the displaced. These are all factors that do not contribute to establishing an environment conducive to a political solution and restoring security and stability to Syria. Madam President, we were hoping that Mr. Lowcock's briefing today would have been more balanced and to refer to the substantial effort made by the Syrian government to deliver humanitarian assistance. We were hoping that you would refer to the disastrous impact of unilateral coercive measures on the Syrian people and to the fact that terrorist groups supported by the Turkish occupation continue to shell cities in Aleppo, which led to the killing of 2 civilians and has injured a number of civilians, including children. The Syrian government reaffirms that it is the first responsible party for the needs of the Syrian people. And we reaffirm that the center of humanitarian work in Syria is Damascus and not any other city in neighboring countries or beyond. This is the simplest embodiment of the principle of the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, which is affirmed by all United Nations relevant resolutions. This also means there's a need to engage in constructive cooperation and effective coordination with the Syrian government to enhance humanitarian work and support the joint efforts of the Syrian government and its partners in providing humanitarian aid and delivering it to those who deserve it in order to achieve tangible qualitative improvement. As for the cross-border assistance mechanism, the Syrian government has repeatedly expressed its serious concerns over it, especially with regard to its violation of the principle of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and the parameters of humanitarian work established by General Assembly Resolution 46/182. The Syrian government, and based on its concern for the needs of the Syrians and the provision of aid to Syrians on all its territories, took the initiative of strengthening cross-line assistance mechanism to improve the humanitarian situation, bearing in mind that the conditions that prevailed at the time of the adoption of Resolution 2165 in 2014 no longer exist. In this regard, I would like to briefly point out a number of grave flaws that accompanied the implementation of the cross-border assistance mechanism. 1. The so-called monitoring mechanism has shown over the past years the inability of those in charge of it to guarantee verification and accuracy standards that ensure due credibility and professionalism. Unfortunately, OCHA office in the Turkish city of Gaziantep does not adhere to the work controls as mandated in the UN Charter, which leads to its exploitation as a tool to serve the agendas of some countries. 2. The distribution mechanism represents the most dangerous aspect of this process due to the lack of transparency and identification of third parties or partners that OCHA refers to in its reports. Add to that the experience of past years, which has shown the terrorist organizations such as Al-Nusra Front and the Levant Liberalization Organization and the White Helmets monopolizing the largest amount of humanitarian aid that the United Nations drops at the borders and using it to finance their terrorist activities, gain loyalties, and recruit new terrorists. 3. This mechanism allowed the Turkish regime to freely sponsor terrorist organizations and to move forward with its policies aimed at changing the demographic character and imposing Turkification measures of various aspects of life in that region, including the imposition of Turkish curricula and circulation of the Turkish currency. The Syrian government is committed to delivering humanitarian aid to all Syrian regions, including cross lines, and it has opened a number of humanitarian crossings in cooperation with our Russian friends, including the one it recently opened in Sarakib. However, we condemn the terrorist groups preventing our people in Idlib from exiting through these humanitarian crossings and holding them as hostages and human shields. The Syrian government considers some countries' intentional disregard of these practices, which represent a violation of international humanitarian law, as an act of support of terrorist organizations controlling Idlib. Madam President, it is reprehensible to hear the statements of some countries blaming the Syrian government for everything related to the human tragedy that its people are undergoing. as a part of the campaign to mislead public opinion and draw its sympathy in order to convince it that these countries have nothing to do with what befell on Syria after 10 years of terrorist war against it. However, despite the extent of the disinformation campaign, they cannot convince anyone that these countries are not responsible for bringing thousands of foreign terrorists to Syria. What is worse is that these governments now refuse to repatriate terrorists to their countries of origin in order to be prosecuted for their crimes and to rehabilitate and reintegrate their women and children. They want those who listen to their statements today to believe that the illegitimate unilateral coercive measures imposed by these countries against the Syrian people, the most recent of which, the so-called Caesar Act, do not represent economic terrorism and a collective punishment. Secretary of State Blinken, in his statement, wondered about the best way to put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people. I will answer you, sir. The first step would be to lift these inhumane coercive measures imposed by your country on the Syrian people. They want us to believe that imposing conditionality on the reconstruction process does not impede the provision of an environment conducive to the voluntary and dignified return of refugees and displaced persons to their areas, nor that it may cause a new refugee crisis. They want us to believe that the Brussels conference held today is a forum for assisting Syrians and support Syria's future, while excluding the Syrian government, and it is used as a platform to target the Syrian government and tarnish its image. In conclusion, I stress that the discussions of the Security Council cannot achieve progress through provocative statements and the use of inappropriate and sometimes rude terms. Progress is only possible by staying away from politicization and through an open and constructive dialogue based on the mutual respect between member states, taking into account the views of the countries concerned with the discussion. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Syria for